Good day. As was the case with my program on Monday, I'm having to make this program early in the day, very early in the day, because for the second time this week, I have to travel out of London on an urgent business matter this time. And the result is that, of course, I have to make this program before much of the news of the day filters through. And again, it's quite possible that events will take place on Friday, today, of which I am not aware as of the time of making of this video. However, I have to say, I don't think we're going to see a repetition of the same dramatic events that we saw on Monday with the cancellation, or rather the Russian decision not to renew the grain deal and the attack on the Kerch Bridge. Having said that, one never knows. The world can throw up unexpected things. Regardless of that, if something big does happen on Friday, today, of which I'm not aware, well, I'll have to cover it in my next video afterwards. And I can only give apologies for that in advance, but unfortunately this trip that I have to do cannot be changed. In the meantime, there's been, however, a great deal of news on the battlefronts about the rather heavy fighting that took place, which I discussed in my previous program. And we can say, yet again, that all of the Ukrainian attacks have been comprehensively repulsed. The attacks that took place in the Orechov sector of the Zaporozhye front lines, an attack apparently also took place near Pyatikhatki, which I didn't mention in my program yesterday. And also there was more attacks, as I've discussed, by Ukraine in the Bakhmut area, where it's now clear that all of the attacks in the Zaporozhye front ended in failure, and no progress of any kind has been made at all on the front lines in the south. In fact, I'm going to say something which is, I think, now gradually coming to be accepted. Ukraine continues to promote the claim that it is making advances, incremental, slow advances over the course of this offensive. It did make some marginal, very marginal gains. It captured a couple of villages during the fighting in June. But over the course of the fighting in July, on the Zaporozhye front lines, these front lines in the south, in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, in southern Donetsk, in the area around Vuhledar, I don't think Ukraine has made any advances at all. If it has done, they're probably confined to the Vremevka ledge, but even there I believe that Ukraine is basically now at a total standstill. So I don't think they've actually made any territorial gains. I don't think they've captured any more villages. They've been trying to capture places like Staromayorsk in the Vremevka ledge. They've made many attempts to capture Rabotino. They've also made, this is in the Zaporozhye region, near Orechov. They've also made many attempts to capture Pyatikhatki, which is the settlement on the front lines in the south, closest to the Dnieper, and where Ukraine has been making many attempts to sort of break through. They've managed at various times to occupy Pyatikhatki, but they've never been able to consolidate control of the village, and on several occasions they've been thrown back from it. And my understanding is that this village, in effect, deserted village, I should make clear, is in the grey zone. In other words, it's not controlled either by Russia or by Ukraine, which is, of course, the way which is, of course, acceptable to the Russians, but presumably not to the Ukrainians. Ukraine has been launching attack after attack in this area. It's tried various tactics. It tried the heavy armoured tactics, the so-called combined arms tactics that the Americans told it to adopt in the first weeks of June. It's then moved to the so-called mosquito attacks, using lightly armed light infantry attacking, following artillery barrages. It's reverted over the last couple of weeks to more heavy armoured attacks. But none of this has made any difference. It's not been able to break through. Its advances in the southern front lines have ground to a total stop. And, of course, it's taken enormous losses. And the scale of these losses is difficult to assess, but I'm going to say a little bit more about them shortly over the course of this program. And as I said, it seems to me we are now at a total standstill in the fighting on the front lines. Now, by my calculations, today, Friday, is the 47th day of this offensive. And as I understand it, the assumption was that Ukraine would be breaking through the Russian defense lines and pushing south towards the Sea of Azov within 5 or 6 days. So 47 days and no progress has been achieved. It's important to stress again that all of the fighting that has taken place on the southern front lines is in what is sometimes referred to as the grey zone, but what is perhaps more accurately referred to as the area of control that the Russians have established ahead of their major fortified lines, which are some kilometres, some tens of kilometres, further south from where all of the fighting we've been hearing about has been taking place. Ukraine has never reached those fortified lines up to this point in any one place, and its attempt to push through and to break through towards those front lines, all that it has done is that it has caused it to suffer very high casualties. Now, this is not something that you will see said in the Western media, and of course it is not also said by Ukraine itself. In the Western media, in Ukraine, in the comments of people like General Milley, it is still suggested that perhaps this offensive, well, it's not going as fast as expected. Russian resistance has been stronger than expected, but nonetheless, some sort of progress is being made. It's incremental, it's slow, huge losses are being expended, but eventually, perhaps, given time, a breakthrough might take place, and in the meantime, progress is being made. I think it is important to say that it is so far, at least, as I said, we're now 47 days into this offensive. The reality is that on the important southern front lines, no progress is being made at all. Ukraine did capture a few villages right at the start of the offensive, but since then they made repeated attacks and they have achieved nothing. Now, it may be that in future weeks they might be a little more successful. They might capture some of these villages, some more of these villages that I've been talking about: Rabotino, Staromayorsk, Pyatichatki, hardly important places in themselves. And they might finally reach those big Russian fortified lines. But when they do, presumably, they will run into a whole new set of problems, enormous problems, arguably bigger problems than the ones that they've encountered up to now. Because logically, breaking through, reaching those fortified lines, one would assume would be the simplest part of this offensive operation. Anyway, that's, I think, a point to make, because despite the clear disappointment that one sees increasingly expressed, even in Western media articles, there is still no acknowledgement in the West that the offensive has ground to a total stop. So that's the situation on the front lines. What else is happening? Well, yesterday, the situation, as I said, around Bakhmut was not fully clear to me. I said that there'd been an intense amount of fighting. I said that Ukraine had gone back on the attack. I said that I got the impression that there had been some gains made, perhaps in the area of Kleshchevka. Well, the fog of war has cleared a little, and I should say, unsurprisingly perhaps, to those of us who follow the sources, the place where it was cleared, at least for me, was Slavyangrad, not for the first time. As I said, a site which combines very skilled reporting with lots of insightful commentary, and also acts as a site aggregator for both Russian and Ukrainian telegram channels. Anyway, it seems that what happened was that there was indeed fighting, a major Ukrainian attack near Kleshchevka and Kurdyumovka, and most of the fighting that took place is around what is referred to as a hill to the northwest of Kleshchevka, a point of high ground. Ukraine has been repeatedly trying to capture this place, apparently ever since the fighting in Bakhmut, on the flanks of Bakhmut, Artyomsk, the city that's now under Russian control and which the Russians refer to as Artyomsk. The Ukrainians have been trying to capture this, let's call it a hill. I'm not sure how high it actually is. This area of high ground, this hill, ever since they started their counterattack in the Bakhmut area in early June, before Bakhmut itself was captured. And the story here has been of Ukraine throwing men and machines to try to capture this hill. Presumably the idea is that you capture the hill, you're able to look down on Kleshchevka, you can consolidate control of the hill, you are then in a position to cause major problems for the Russians in Kleshchevka, and perhaps oblige the Russians to withdraw from Kleshchevka. Anyway, I've been trying to capture this hill and to consolidate control of it ever since the early weeks of May. And they have managed to drive the Russians off this hill several times. They've launched major attacks, but they've never been able to consolidate control. The Russians have always launched counterattacks. Every one of these counterattacks eventually ends with the Ukrainians driven off the hill and the Russians back in control. And it seems that this is exactly what happened again in the fighting yesterday. Ukraine once more lost large numbers of men, some machines, infantry fighting vehicles, mostly old Soviet-made infantry fighting vehicles, trying to capture this hill. It did occupy it for a short time, but the Ukrainian troops were never able to consolidate. The Russians counterattacked, and I say the Russians, there are a lot of Chechen fighters now fighting this particular area. The Russians counterattacked, and they regained control of the hill, and my understanding is that they control it again, and in effect, the Ukrainians have been pushed back to their start lines. And this has been the pattern of the fighting in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, for weeks now. It's more fluid than the fighting in the south. Ukraine, however, launches attacks. The attacks gain some ground. The Russians pull back, as is, by the way, their practice. They don't let themselves get trapped into hand-to-hand fighting for untenable positions. The Ukrainians suffer heavy losses from Russian artillery and Russian missile strikes and Russian bombing strikes. And then, of course, the Russians counterattack and the Ukrainians are pushed back to their start lines again. Now, saying all of this, it's important to stress that in this kind of fluid fighting, as I've discussed before, the Russians will certainly be taking casualties, probably more casualties than they are taking in the more static fighting in the south. But nonetheless, all the indications are that it is the Ukrainian military that is suffering the heaviest losses in the Bakhmut area, probably at least 3 times greater than those that the Russians are suffering, given that the Russians have clear-cut superiority in artillery and aircraft and are therefore in a better position to inflict losses than to receive them. So that's the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, the Western media has come up with various rationalizations for the failure of this offensive up to this point. And before I discuss these, I just want to say something. We are now 47 days into the offensive. Now, a couple of videos ago, I said that on the assumption that Ukraine had been supplied 1 million rounds of 155mm ammunition before the offensive began, and on the further assumption that Ukraine was expending ammunition, 155mm ammunition, at the rate of 10,000 rounds a day, then I said that I thought the offensive might last around 100 days, and that beyond August, it would be increasingly difficult to sustain. And I also reported in another video a short time ago that according to what appeared to be well-informed reports from Ukrainian sources, General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces, has advised President Zelensky of the same thing, that he doesn't see this offensive as being sustainable beyond the end of August, at least on the southern front lines. And we are now, in effect, halfway through that point. We've now reached a situation where the offensive has been underway for just over 6 weeks. We have roughly 6 weeks left to the end of August. Now, that is creating, or so it seems to me, a major another major time issue for Ukraine, because if they're not able to break through before the end of August, well, they've now received cluster munitions, and that will extend the time beyond which they run out of ammunition. They're never going to run out of ammunition entirely. The United States will always be able to deliver some from its current production, and it will always obviously be able to provide Ukraine with some cluster munitions. They will never run out of ammunition entirely. But of course, the question is not whether they run out of ammunition completely. It's whether they have enough ammunition to sustain offensive operations. And I still think that even with the cluster munitions being supplied, given that cluster munitions are only useful in some situations, I still think that more likely than not, we will start to see the offensive run down by the end of August. And as I said, we're halfway there now. So that leaves Ukraine with a very, very difficult task, because it's got to reach those dense Russian fortifications in the south. It's got to break through them. 3 layers of fortifications in many places, in some places even more than that. The goal, for example, is to capture a town called Tokmak, and then advance from Tokmak towards Melitopol, and then once Melitopol is reached, push on towards the Sea of Azov. Now, I'm not the best person with satellite pictures or with maps, but I have seen some maps which show Tokmak, for example, surrounded by enormously elaborate Russian fortification systems, which the Russians have created specifically to defend this particular town. And this is separate from those other big fortified belts that the Russians have created in other places on the front lines. So one can see the challenge that the Ukrainians are facing if they don't, in needing to break through all of these heavy fortifications within the next 6 weeks or so. But let's assume, and these were guesstimates about, my saying that it would be the end of August, even though apparently General Zaluzhny agrees. But let's assume that, in fact, in terms of ammunition, we're not looking at manpower reserves, armoured reserves. Let's assume that, in fact, Ukraine can keep going for some time longer. Let's say it's able to keep going through September and early October, another 6 weeks beyond that. We've already gone through, in that case, a third of the time that could be practically allocated to this offensive. The offensive cannot be sustained beyond mid-October in any event, because it is in mid-October that the rains begin and the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud, starts to take effect, in effect obstructing movement. So Ukraine has used up perhaps half its time window. If you want to be, from a Ukrainian point of view, an optimist, perhaps a third of it. But clearly the clock is ticking. And at the rate Ukraine is advancing, it is facing an enormously daunting task if it is going to actually break through and achieve the objectives that it set itself and which its Western allies set for it when this offensive was first planned. So, there are, of course, uncertainties in war. It could be that when Ukraine reaches these fortifications, the Russian forces themselves will have been depleted already by the fighting in this zone of control. It could be that the Russians run out of reserves. It could be that the Russian troops panic and turn round and flee. There's no sign of anything like that at the moment. It could be that, as I said, as some have suggested, the hardest part of an offensive are the first days and weeks. But I have to say, based so far on what has been happening, that doesn't seem likely, or at least it doesn't seem likely to me. Anyway, there we go. We're perhaps halfway through, in practical terms, how long this offensive can continue for. But let's come to the various comments that have been made about the progress of this offensive. Firstly, there's been a long article in Newsweek based heavily on the information provided to Newsweek by an American instructor, somebody who's there trying to instruct the Ukrainians on how to conduct the war. And this particular instructor confirms that progress in the offensive has been exceptionally slow. He is critical of Ukrainian tactics, though he's moderate in his criticism, but he is nonetheless critical. He talks about extremely heavy losses, and of that there is no doubt. There are increasing numbers of reports that Ukrainian cemeteries are running out of space to bury new bodies. There's also reports I've read in the Western media about casualty stations and hospitals across Ukraine having become overwhelmed by the flow of the injured and the wounded from the battle lines. So the losses are indeed extremely high. But the key point that this trainer, this person who's been trying to train the Ukrainians and teach them things about how to conduct war, the key point he's making is that it's now or never for Ukraine unless Ukraine wins the war over the next few months, over the course of this offensive. Then realistically it's not going to win at all. And I come back to the point I've just been making about the time window. At best, that means that Ukraine only has until mid-October in order to win the war. If my points about ammunition are correct, and as I said, General Zaluzhny apparently thinks the same, we're talking about perhaps 6 weeks. And I should say that this instructor, as is now the practice in the West, he says that if Ukraine fails to break through, he's still hopeful that there will be a breakthrough in some place, though he admits that he's seen no sign of that happening up to this point, but he does think that, all of these Ukrainian attacks along the front lines, sooner or later they will find a weak spot and Ukraine will be able to ram through in some way. With what? Given the heavy depletion of its manpower, it's not clear, but we'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, that's what he says. But he speaks about Ukraine having to win this war this year. I've said that the time frame to do that is now dwindling. But of course, the one thing he won't do, the one thing he won't say, is that if Ukraine doesn't win the war this year, then it will lose the war. But that is the reality. And here I have to come back to a point which has been made by Larry Johnson. The worst case scenario that is acceptable in Western media and official commentary is not an outright Russian victory, but supposedly a stalemated war. But how can this war end in the kind of stalemate that people in the West want to believe is the worst case scenario if Ukraine doesn't win? Ukraine's stock of weapons is becoming depleted. The West's ability to rebuild that stock of weapons is becoming depleted as well. The West is talking about ramping up production of weapons, but this is proving incredibly difficult, and it might not be possible in any remotely acceptable time frame. If we're talking about ammunition production, it's not going to happen for years, and Ukraine doesn't have those years. The West has struggled to put together convincing armoured packages for Ukraine. Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s have been supplied in relatively small numbers, but as we see, they've not made any great impact on the battlefronts. The Leopard 2s have all been burning up on the fields, on the battlefields. The United States, for the moment, is replacing Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Stryker infantry fighting vehicles, but these two are being burned up at a frightening rate. And yes, the United States, before the war, had a stockpile of about 2,000 of these in reserve, not all of which, by the way, might be usable, but besides which it will need some of that stockpile to provide replacements for its own military if its military find itself in a combat situation. And that stockpile of 2,000 Bradleys might sound like a lot of Bradleys, but not if Ukraine is burning up Bradleys at the rate of 200 every 6 weeks, which seems to be roughly the scale at which these have been burnt up at the moment. In fact, we're going to reach a point, I suspect, where the Pentagon starts to push back against supplies of Bradleys. Now, there've been reports, well, I discussed yesterday in my program how Russia has now, in effect, imposed a sea blockade on Ukraine. They've launched overwhelming missile attacks on Ukraine's Black Sea ports. There's been an interesting new piece of information coming out of the United States. It turns out that the United States is now desperately short of anti-ship missiles. In other words, harpoons and such things. And it needs those harpoon missiles that it does have to contest China in the Pacific, where the Chinese Navy is engaged in a major build-up, and where, of course, by the way, the Chinese Navy is currently engaged in joint exercises with the Russian Navy. There are these joint exercises underway at precisely this particular time. So, the United States is short of anti-ship missiles. Now, Ukraine has used or tried to use anti-ship missiles from its coast to protect its coastline. It had those Neptune anti-ship missiles, which it claims sank the Moskva cruiser last year. Maybe they did. The United States provided Ukraine with some Harpoon missiles at one time. I recall that there was a complicated story of the United States having to adapt Harpoon systems for use from land, from ground launchers, and I seem to remember that some of the Scandinavian countries also supplied Harpoons. But it turns out that these are in short supply also. Whereas Russia, by contrast, not only is not short of anti-ship missiles, but it is fielding hypersonic anti-ship missiles on its warships. The Zircon anti-ship missile has now entered production and will shortly be in service with the Russian fleet. And of course, Russian warships are abundantly supplied with large stocks of anti-ship missiles, some of which, by the way, have a land attack role, as we have seen. So, and many of which are supersonic, which of course the Harpoon is not. So the Russians have perhaps they're in a stronger position now to impose a sea blockade, because in light of the shortages of Harpoon missiles, the United States and Ukraine have fewer systems that they can deploy on land on the Black Sea coast in order to resist that sea blockade. So, how does Ukraine, lacking armour, experiencing growing ammunition shortages, struggling to make up the numbers in its military as more and more losses are being experienced all the time, and losses, it should be stressed, in trained manpower, how does it sustain a war if it cannot win this war this year? How is it expected to keep fighting for 5 years, as this instructor said? And the interesting thing about the Newsweek article is that he conceded that Western support for Ukraine would probably dwindle, and he said that what the West might need to do is find ways for Ukraine to become more self-sufficient in defending itself. How is that going to happen with the Russians launching missile attacks every day across Ukraine? How does one make Ukraine more self-sufficient in this kind of situation? I think people in the West need to face up to the reality that this war is not going to last for years. It's lasted longer than many people, myself included, expected. But that has only been the case because of this enormous flood of Western aid that started back in March of last year. And it has enabled Ukraine to hold off the Russian army for a year and a half, but we are probably now coming towards the end of that. And this offensive, the offensive that is underway now, according to this instructor, is the last chance, the last possibility Ukraine has to win the war, and his assumption that it will be a forever war, as he says, or a stalemate beyond that, seems to me wildly unrealistic. There's also, of course, further explanations. There's been a long article in the Financial Times in which, once again, the entire problem that Ukraine is supposedly facing is minefields. That these Russian minefields that the Russians have created in southern Ukraine have presented Ukraine with immense problems. And one of the interesting things about this long article in the Financial Times is that there was no actual solution offered to how to deal with this problem of minefields. There was an expert who was quoted in the Financial Times who said that one of the problems in clearing minefields, or trying to clear minefields, is that with the mechanisms that exist today, as quickly as Ukraine clears a pathway through the minefields, the Russians, once whatever Ukrainian attack through this pathway has been defeated, they're able remotely to lay more mines again. They're able to reseed the minefield with more mines. And as I said, in the long grass, the mines may be there above ground, but they will be concealed to a great extent by the grass and the vegetation. So there's no simple way of dealing with the minefields. But the minefields are hardly the only problem. It's not as if Ukraine is being prevented from conducting its offensive because the Russians have laid lots of mines. If there were no Russian fighters, soldiers, defending their positions behind the minefields, then the Ukrainians would find a way through. The reason why Ukraine can't penetrate these minefields is because the Russians are there, contrary to many Western expectations. They didn't turn round and flee. That seems to have been a widespread assumption based on an inaccurate understanding of what happened in the Kharkiv offensive of last year. The Russians haven't turned back, they haven't fled, they've held their positions. They have overwhelming superiority in artillery, which superiority is set to grow as Ukraine's ammunition stocks become depleted. And of course, they have comprehensive superiority in the air. Now, the White House has just issued another statement, even just a short time before I made this program, in which they said that, yes, it's just about possible that Ukraine might get some F-16s this year. I have to say that that's looking unlikely. Apparently, training of pilots to fly the F-16s hasn't even started yet. But let's assume that, yes, they do get the F-16s by the end of this year, though next year is perhaps more likely. And the Pentagon seems to be extremely skeptical and resistant to the whole idea. Well, even the White House says that it's not going to change the direction of the conflict. And General Milley has said that Ukraine would need years of aircraft supplies and training and building up of its logistical infrastructure before it could possibly hope to take on the Russian Air Force on equal terms. And that's, of course, assuming that the Russians stand still and do nothing to develop their Air Force over the course of that period, which is, of course, inconceivable. So, the Russians have superiority in the air, they have superiority in terms of ammunition and artillery. The United States has given them the gift of supplying Ukraine with cluster munitions, which leaves it open for the Russians to use cluster munitions themselves against Ukrainian light infantry trying to navigate these minefields. I don't like to put it this way. This is a horrendous situation. But the fact is that it's easy to see how, from a Russian point of view, using cluster munitions against the advancing Ukrainians makes a lot more sense than it makes sense for the Ukrainians to use cluster munition against the fortified and heavily protected Russians, some of whom are in trenches and some of whom are in armoured vehicles that are apparently more resistant to these cluster munitions than light infantry are. So, how, in light of all of this and the gathering economic crisis that Ukraine is experiencing, and I'm going to come to that in a moment, can you sustain this war for the kind of 5 years that this instructor is talking about? It's not just a problem of the Russians having planted large numbers of minefields. The problem is that the Russians outmatch Ukraine at every level, in numbers of trained troops, in artillery, in aircraft, in tanks, in minefields, in electronic warfare. They've been apparently incredibly effective in jamming Ukrainian signals. I read a comment somewhere that a Ukrainian officer was complaining that Ukrainian radios, which were designed to operate over distances of tens of kilometers, only actually work when they're just a few meters, 100 meters from each other, because the Russian jamming is now so effective. So, and of course, I haven't even started on drones, kamikaze drones, and all of those things. How is Ukraine going to sustain a war for any length of time if he can't win this year? If it doesn't win this year, and if winning this year is its last opportunity to achieve victory. Let me talk about this economic situation as well. This has been discussed by me many, many times. Ukraine's economy, to all intents and purposes, has functionally ceased to exist. Its industrial plants its industrial base has been heavily hammered by Russian missile attacks, which have been going on now for a year and a half. The Ukrainians are very concerned about more Russian attacks on their energy infrastructure in the autumn and winter period, which is now coming. We'll see whether that does in fact happen. But with their air defense system now severely depleted, and by the way, with the Russians having a much better idea of how the energy system works, it's easy to see why the Ukrainians are worried about a Russian offensive against Ukraine's energy system. But of course, the other topic now is agriculture. And I've already explained that foodstuffs are the largest single export item that Ukraine has. And now, of course, exports through the Black Sea have been cut off. Now, there's a lot of talk about Ukraine sending its food exports by rail and road through Eastern Europe. But there are potential problems with this. First of all, it is much more expensive to transport large cargoes by rail and far more expensive to do it by road than it is to do it by ship. So if you're going to send large amounts of grain by, say, rail to Western ports for export around the world, you're going to add very considerably to the cost of those food exports. You're going to make them much more expensive than they would otherwise be. And apparently the rail infrastructure in Eastern Europe to transport large amounts of grain from Ukraine, maize, wheat, oilseeds, that kind of thing, the railway infrastructure is not particularly well developed. It was never developed for this kind of thing. The railway lines that went from the Ukrainian fields towards the southern ports were designed for moving large amounts of grain to the ships, to the ports, so that they could be embarked on the ships. And of course the distances anyway were small. This is going to be a much more challenging logistical operation and an expensive one. There has to be a very real possibility that the grain will arrive in Eastern Europe if it is sent by land, and that it will make a lot more economic sense for it to stay there. Not, in other words, to be transported further west towards the EU's ports for re-export to Africa, Latin America, or wherever. Problem is that the East European states, Poland, Romania, Hungary, all of the rest, have become have farming populations which have become extremely angry about the flood of Ukrainian grain that has already been pouring into their countries. They have not been happy about the way this grain is depressing prices and is driving their own agricultural products out of the markets. The governments of all of these countries have responded. They've restricted imports of Ukrainian foodstuffs, and they've just reiterated that they still want those restrictions to remain in effect. They're demanding some kind of pan-European solution. It's not at all clear how that is going to work out, and even if it does work out, or even if some kind of plan is put together, it might not be a workable plan, and it might result in the same kind of protests from the farmers in Eastern Europe, which we have seen previously. So, this might not be a simple operation. And in addition, difficulties of exporting grain is going to affect revenue provided to the farmers. Farmers in Ukraine are already under extreme pressure because of the war. They're going to have problems getting spare parts for their tractors, fertilizer. Funding for these things is going to be difficult. It's unlikely that the Western powers will be prepared to provide that funding. And there's a possibility that we're going to see a very significant decline in food production in Ukraine over and above that which has already taken place. Now, to be very clear, Ukraine itself will always have enough food. It's not going to starve. It's a country which produces a lot of food. But its agriculture will probably go into decline, even as its industrial base has collapsed, and even as the financial parts of the economy and parts of the service sector now function purely as a result of Western financial support. how is that sustainable for years? It isn't. At some point, if there's a major recession in the West, if the Russian army continues its advances, if Western leaders start to become skeptical about Ukraine's long-term future, even as they face increasing budget problems of their own, the pressure will be on in the West to cut back spending on Ukraine, and any cutback in spending on Ukraine is going to have a cascade effect. It's going to cause major problems in the Ukrainian economy, which, as I said, is now in effect on life's functioning, on life support. The simple reality is that Ukraine doesn't have any prospect of sustaining this war for years on end by itself. In fact, Western officials have actually admitted, Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy spokesman, has actually admitted that without Western support, Ukraine would collapse within weeks. So it can't sustain the war. There is no possible scenario where Ukraine is able to fight the Russians and achieve a stalemate by itself, and with Western supplies of equipment and munitions dwindling, and with Ukraine's economy running into ever deeper problems, the ability of the Western powers to sustain all of this, to sustain this conflict, to sustain Ukraine in this conflict, is wearing thin and is also becoming unsustainable. Now, contrast this with the situation on the other side. Now, Vladimir Putin had a long meeting with members of his government in Moscow on the 19th of July, on Thursday, in other words. And it's a very, very interesting meeting in many respects. He had a lot to say, for example, about the grain deal. He was, again, very angry about the way in which the Russians were taken for a ride, that they were constantly given promises that were never fulfilled about how the grain deal, the western part of the grain deal, the conditions that had been, the West had taken on. The Western powers always pretended that they would come around eventually to fulfilling their side of the bargain, but they never did. And Putin is very, very angry and annoyed about this. But he says a lot about that over the course of this meeting. But it's important to say that he says this not out of the blue, but in a discussion of the agricultural situation in Russia, the situation with farming. And he's had a report from his agriculture minister, Dmitry Patrushev, who is, by the way, the brother of Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, the secretary of Russia's Security Council. And Dmitry Patrushev informed Putin that Russian agriculture is still on a firm upward spiral, and that it expects to have another bumper harvest of at least 125 million tons in grain harvest this year. More than enough to satisfy all domestic needs and to provide food for export. So that's a report about the agricultural situation. Now, it isn't the only issue that was discussed at this meeting. There was a long discussion, for example, about the civil aviation sector. Now, right at the beginning of this conflict, back in March, the EU and the West effectively put Russia's aviation sector under blockade. Russian aircraft, civil aircraft, airlines were forbidden from flying into EU territory and into the territory of the United States. And supplied the companies from which the Russians had leased much of their civil airline fleet, they cancelled the leases and demanded return of the aircraft, and suppliers of spare parts withheld spare parts for the operation of the Russian air fleet, the Russian aircraft, the Western aircraft, the Airbuses and the Boeings that form part of the Russian air fleet. Well, there were lots of claims, as I very well remember, from all sorts of people, that within a couple of days, Russian airlines would be grounded. There would be no more aircraft essentially flying in Russia. Well, Putin has now had a report from his air minister. And this air minister tells him that, in fact, Russian airlines flew 100 million customers, mainly in domestic flights, though they are also engaged in foreign flights. He said if there had been no restrictions, the number of passengers that would have been carried would have been 120 million. But this is apparently a very large number. He said that the Russians have sorted out all the problems with spare parts to keep their fleets going. He said that the air fleets are operating entirely normally, that they've resumed international flights to selected destinations, including Cuba, by the way. And he said that the Russians are also now are ramping up domestic production of aircraft, and that they need more of these domestically produced aircraft, both to expand their current fleet and ultimately to replace the Western aircraft that make up that current fleet. And by the way, there was a rather sharp exchange between this air minister and Putin over the course of this meeting, and Putin made this rather acid point to him. He said, remember when you were still the head of Aeroflot, that's Russia's national airline, I tried to persuade you to order as many domestically produced aircraft as possible. There were even heated words between us about this. You assured me that Western partners were reliable and that everything there was good and that they are good. But now our aircraft manufacturers, of course, cannot expand production capabilities overnight. This will take some time, even though the order has now appeared and is increasing. And Putin complains that the aviation minister is saying that ticket prices on Russian aircraft tariffs are higher than they might otherwise have been, and he sort of implies that this is partly the result of wrong decisions to rely on imports of Western aircraft instead of buying Russian aircraft produced in Russia. Anyway, he talks about that, and in fact, Aeroflot, the Russian airlines, since they can't now buy Western aircraft, are indeed placing increasing orders for Russian-produced aircraft. The MS-21, which is now about to enter production a heavily Russianized version of the Sukhoi Superjet. These are narrow-bodied aircraft. The Tupolev 214, a legacy aircraft from Soviet times, but still a reliable aircraft. Apparently it is the Russian equivalent of the Boeing 757. And we have wide-bodied aircraft also on the way, a revived form of the Ilyushin 96, and probably an aircraft that has been developed together with China. But anyway, so Putin discusses the situation with aviation. He then has a very interesting discussion with Elvira Nabiullina, the chair of the Russian Central Bank, about the introduction by Russia of the digital ruble, which is now expected to take place in 2025. Now, I know an awful lot of people have deep misgivings about digital currencies, the introduction of digital currencies. So do I, by the way. But the fact is that the Russians have a plan to introduce them, and it's a highly developed, well-developed plan. Nabiullina went into great detail about how it's going to work. She did make clear, incidentally, that the Russians do not intend to do away with cash. What she said is that they will have simultaneously three types of money: cash, non-cash money, in other words, debit cards, the money that one transfers in debit cards, credit cards, bank transfers, that sort of thing. And digital rubles will function alongside these and will do so pegged to the same value as these. But anyway, she went into a great deal of detail about how all of this would work and how it would assist business people, that's her interpretation, and how it would also assist cross-border trade. And she finished by saying that fairly soon, by the late 2020s, Russia will have a complete financial architecture. It will have its own interbank payment system. It will have its own debit card system around the Mir card. It will have its own digital currency. It will have the lot. It will have reproduced every single instrument and vehicle that the Western financial systems have. It will have its own homegrown versions of these. And of course, the Russian banking system is stable and strong in contrast to those of the West. So that was Nabiullina. She was talking a lot about those sort of things. And then we also had a long discussion about actions taken to promote the work of entrepreneurs. And there was also an announcement that Russia, or rather an agreement that Russia should move forward and develop and agree, and this is going to happen within a few days, electronic visas for short-stay visitors, including, by the way, short-stay visitors from the West. It will be possible to get an electronic visa quickly via the internet, and this will be good for staying in Russia for a period of up to 16 days. So, the point I'm trying to make is that even as Ukraine survives from hand to mouth, depends on Western supplies, is bogged down in this offensive. On the Russian side, Putin has time to forward plan. Ukraine is crisis managing. Putin has the ability to talk about future ideas. He's able to talk about development of agriculture, development of civil aviation, development of digital currencies, the digital ruble, help from entrepreneurs, introduction of e-visas, all that sort of thing. It is a stark difference in the situation between these two countries. And I'm not going to repeat what I've said many times about the enormous increases in Russian military production. I've discussed this many times in many programs. There is no reason to doubt that this is actually the case. Russian ammunition use on the battlefronts confirms it, as does the increasing number of Russian drones. At the start of the war, Ukraine, by universal agreement, was more advanced in drone warfare than Russia is. The Ukrainians themselves now admit that the Russians have overtaken them in use of drones, and of course the Russians have perfected the use of kamikaze drones in ways that no other military in the world has done. And that is the reality of a growing economy on the one hand, a sustainable economy on the other, a sustainable economy, an economy that is churning out weapon systems and which is sustaining living standards. And by contrast, a Ukraine which has lost its major export, which has seen its ports taken apart, where its armies are at a standstill on the front lines, and where, I haven't covered it in this program, the Russians are actually advancing on the northern fronts, inching ever closer to the recapture of Kupiansk and Liman, and who knows, perhaps other places as well. This fiction, this story that this war is heading towards a stalemate if Ukraine doesn't win it this year, is a dangerous one. It perhaps reinforces a sense of complacency in the West. It might make some people in the West, some officials, perhaps the President of the United States, think that they have time on their side and that they can spin this on out indefinitely, and that sooner or later the Russians will tire and come to terms. That is not what is going to happen. We now have an article from somebody who knows the state of Ukraine's military, who says that Ukraine only has this year in which to defeat Russia. As I said, the reality is that has to happen within a few weeks or months at most, before the middle of October, at the most pessimistic, on the most optimistic view, perhaps as soon as the end of August. Beyond that, if Ukraine hasn't achieved a breakthrough, if the battle lines at the end of this offensive are essentially the same as they were when they started, or as they are now, which I have to say, to me at the moment, is looking increasingly likely, well, in that case, we're going to see a steady degradation of Ukraine's position. We're not looking at a stalemate. We're looking at a situation where it will be the Russians who will achieve the initiative and the eventual breakthroughs, who will complete their military operation, and who will eventually dictate terms. So let me repeat again the point I made in my last programme. This is the time for Western leaders to start focusing on the realities, to put aside all the spin, all the nonsense about Ukraine winning, about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, all those sort of things. The time window is not, I think, as wide as some Western leaders think. Putting aside what happens to Ukraine, if they want to avoid a geopolitical disaster, which is what an outright Russian victory and Ukrainian defeat would now be. And it's important to say that if the West had allowed Ukraine to be defeated in the first months of the war, or had allowed Ukraine to come to a peace treaty with Russia in the first months of the war, as the Russians and the Ukrainians tried to agree, well, it would have been a setback for the West, but it would certainly not be a geopolitical disaster on the scale that we will see if Ukraine is defeated after the Western powers have pulled out all the stops to try to enable Ukraine to prevail. Well, if Western leaders want to avoid a geopolitical disaster, which will have not just an impact on the West itself, but an impact on the West's positions globally, then they need to put aside career considerations, foolish notions of Ukrainian victory, still more foolish notions of a Ukrainian stalemate. And they need to understand that talk of freezing the conflict is not on the agenda, and they need to act immediately to reopen communication lines to Moscow. But they've already said in their NATO communique that that is what they want to do. But they need to actually start telling the Russians that they're prepared to talk about a full settlement of the crisis in Ukraine, conceding many of the points, for example, about NATO membership, that they've not been prepared to concede up to now, but also being prepared finally to talk about the security situation in Europe. Well, that's my programme for today. There'll no doubt be much more news on the battlefronts over the next couple of days. And I have to say that for the moment, it seems to me that the conflict in Ukraine is not exactly frozen, but in effect stuck. The West is stuck, Ukraine is stuck, they're stuck on the battlefields, they're stuck without ideas, and as I said, the clock is ticking down. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the time button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.